Hi, and welcome to Check Your Thread, a podcast about sewing more sustainably. My name's Zoe, and I'm obsessed with sewing. I've been blogging about it for over 13 years and am the creator and host of the popular handmade wardrobe challenge, Me Made May. But like many people, I've become increasingly concerned about the climate crisis and the way my lifestyle contributes to it. So in this podcast, I'll be nerding out about making clothes whilst exploring how to minimise the negative impact that it may have. I really hope you'll join me on this journey. Hello, lovely listeners. How are you doing? Depending on where you live, are you feeling a bit of summer or winter fatigue? The weather has got a lot cooler here this week and I'm really enjoying it. I'm really excited for autumn. I love the whole get stuck in back to school vibe and I'm feeling really motivated for that. Anyway, let's talk sewing. I hope that your projects that you're working on are bringing you joy. Since I've been back from my break, I've been sewing some undies for me and my kids using scraps of fabric, obviously. Plus, I made a couple of Loo box tops, which is a pattern by Sew DIY. And I used some lovely slubby white jersey that was kind of given to me by Craft and Thrift, Amy. I've made one for myself and one for my friend Harriet. You can see that on my Instagram at SozoBlog. Harriet lives in Spain and it gets really hot and sticky there. So hopefully it'll help her keep cool. And anyway, Harriet also really appreciates the time and effort and skill that goes into handmade clothing. So I love making stuff for her. Sustainability wise, it's probably time for a garden update now. So I get a weekly organic fruit and veg box delivery from Abel and Cole. So at the beginning of the year, I set myself a goal, which was to grow enough stuff in my little garden to warrant pausing my veg box for a few weeks. This has not happened. Nothing in my little garden has been super successful. Plus, there hasn't been a sufficient variety of produce grown to even vaguely challenge the contents of my veg box. Plus, Abel and Cole have now introduced the ability to swap out some of the contents that you'll receive. So I've swapped out some courgettes and now tomatoes for other produce because I have managed to grow those, but that's about it. So it's time for me to learn what I can from my growing experiments this year. I've learned that it's not worth going to war against the many slugs and snails in my garden. So instead, next year, I plan to only grow stuff that they're not really into. I'm also going to put a lot of work into improving the quality of my soil with my homemade compost. Plus, I'm going to be careful to grow the different types of plants in different sections of my garden next year in an attempt to kind of do some crop rotation on a kind of micro scale. Plus, it's also important to acknowledge the successes. Once again, tomatoes have been the biggest success. In fact, I've got a batch of tomato sauce in the hob right now to use up a little glut of some of the beefsteak ones. I grew some great spring onions, which I've never tried before, and Fruit Corner is doing very well. I wasn't expecting to get any raspberries this year, but I've got a decent amount, even though those raspberry canes were new, so that bodes really well for next year. And the rhubarb is also giant. I'm very far from meeting my personal food security goals, which is something I plan to talk about on the podcast going forwards, but I'm learning and I'm making small inroads. If you grow food, please let me know via email or Instagram what's been going well for you this year. I'd love to help you celebrate your successes. So I want to say an enormous thanks this week to Carolyn and Kathleen for supporting the podcast via Patreon. It is such a tricky time for so many people financially, and I'm so grateful for those who are able and have chosen to support the podcast. And I also completely understand when others have to stop their monthly support. For details on how you can help keep this podcast afloat, please find the link in the show notes or on the website checkyourthread.com. Okay, let's get into today's episode. So this is the first of 2 episodes featuring a wonderful conversation that I had with designer Birgitta Helmersson. Birgitta is known in the sewing community as a zero-waste pattern designer, but she also produces a range of zero-waste clothing which she sells from her studio/shop in Malmo in Sweden. In this episode, Birgitta tells us all about her fascinating career, including how she came to the decision to include zero-waste principles and practices into her business. I know you're going to love this conversation, and make sure that you come back again next week for the second part. All right, enjoy. Good morning, how are you doing?
Hey, good, how are you?
I'm good. I'm so excited to talk to you and a bit nervous, hence the breathing that I was just
Yes. No, don't be nervous. I am nervous also.
Are you?
Yeah, of course. whenever you're like recorded for something and,
Yeah. Have you done podcasts and stuff like that before?
I've done one before.
What was that one?
Called Love Zero Waste. It's a two Swedish women who do it, and they kind of speak to people in different areas of zero waste. Not just clothing, but food production and all sorts.
I'll check that out. Can I get the pronunciation of your name correct, please?
Yes.
How do I?
Well, okay, so it's Birgitta Helmersson, but you don't have to pronounce it like that. I grew up in Australia, so over there they say Birgitta Helmersson.
Right, okay.
You can say Birgitta. Yeah.
Birgitta.
A very Swedish name for someone that is quite Australian, actually. But anyway.
That's interesting. I didn't know that you grew up in Australia.
Yeah. I'm like the Australian with a very Swedish name over here.
Right.
And my Swedish is pretty good, but it's not as good as it used to be when I was a kid. And so sometimes people look at me a bit weird.
What's wrong with you? You've got the most Swedish name. Thank you so much for giving me a big old chunk of your morning. I'm very, very grateful. I'll try not to run on too much. Yes. I'm sure you're very, very busy. So I'm sure that many of the podcast listeners already know who you are. But if you wouldn't mind, could you tell us who you are, where you are, and what fills your days?
Yes. So my name is Birgitta Helmersson, and I am in Malmö, Sweden. Yeah, I'm a designer and pattern maker working with zero waste pattern making predominantly. And what fills my days? I work a lot of it, looking after my two kids. I've got a 2-year-old and a 9-year-old.
Right.
So, the general shuffling around from this and that, all the different things.
Yeah.
And at the moment, that's pretty much it.
That's a lot.
It's a lot. Yes.
So you are super well known in the sewing community as a zero waste designer, but have you always been creative? Have you explored other disciplines before you got to kind of clothes making?
Not really, actually.
Oh, really? Straight there, I know what I want to do.
Yes, actually, from when I was really young, I know at age 12, I really started learning to make clothes myself, but before that, I was still interested in clothing and making clothing. And, back then too, I'm 38. I had to think about that for a second. 38 years old. But, back then I was very inspired by, all the designers of the 90s, like Alexander McQueen and Vivienne Westwood. And so, even from a young age, it was my dream to be this,
amazing.
And I think it's changed over the years what I wanted to become. But that was sort of really, I always wanted to do it. Yeah.
Oh, I love that. How did you learn when you were 12? Did you have a family member helping you? Did you go to a class?
Well, my mum told me recently, because I know that I bought a sewing machine when I was 12. And she said she bought it for me because I started sewing all my own clothes by hand. And I was sort of, just experimenting, and they were very rough, just taking things apart and figuring out how to make things. And that's really where I began. And then my mum bought me this clunky old sort of secondhand machine. Worked great. And then, really just went from there. And I was very much self-taught from the beginning. Right. And, it's a big learning process. I got as far as I could, but then I did end up starting to take lessons and things in pattern making when I was around 17 and onwards.
Right.
And that's when I started to really learn about, but I also discovered that I could make anything, it was quite liberating and exciting.
Yeah. So you went on to work in more traditional versions of kind of clothing creation, didn't you?
Yeah, I did. But my career really started actually very much from the ground up. I didn't study fashion at university or anything. And I had thought that maybe one day I would. I ended up studying fine art in my early 20s.
That's so funny because you were so focused on clothing from the beginning. You're like, wait, hold that. I'm going to go and do fine art.
I don't know what it was, but I really just wanted to get in there and start working. So my first job that I managed to get, and I actually grew up in Perth, Western Australia. So there's not a huge amount of job options there within fashion and textiles, to be honest. But I ended up starting to work for an embroidery company. Oh. So they would do embroideries and things for businesses. And so I learned how to use the machines. And it was very much like this proper sort of back end of it's not so glamorous, but I really enjoyed it.
Oh, you learned a lot.
Yeah. So, and then from there, I actually got a job working at a clothing alterations place. And originally I was just, like a service person and doing fittings and things like that. And I was always begging my boss to let me sew. And because I didn't actually have any sort of training that he could see, he didn't want me to. And then over, maybe 6 months or so, I started doing it just when we were busy. I would grab things and help out the ladies out the back. And then he found all the dockets one day from all the jobs I'd worked on. And he was like, did you do all of this? And then from there, he let me work as a tailor. And I ended up, that's really actually where I learned so much.
Yeah.
It's one of the most amazing ways to learn to sew.
Yeah.
Because, you're taking apart things and putting them back together. And also just the amazing people that I worked with. They were all, most of them a lot older than me. I was maybe 18, 19 when I started. And from all different parts of the world, and they all had, their own ways of doing things. And so I really learned a lot of amazing little tricks and how to be really efficient, because we had to be pretty fast.
Yeah.
Also quality, so it was this kind of balance, and it was a really good experience.
Interesting, yeah. Once again, looking at how garments are already constructed, and then
exactly
to work backwards.
Yeah.
Oh, so cool. And then what?
And then what? So then from there, I ended up going to uni. I didn't actually finish. I started and did 1 year in fine art, but I wanted to specialize in textiles. And actually, that's always been a big area of interest for me too. Not just designing clothing, but I love textiles. I love anything with texture and color and, patchworking. And that's it for me. It's actually a big part of my inspiration. And there were times when I've thought, maybe I would go that route as well, to be a textile designer. I think I just love making clothes too much. So but then from there, I did this 1 year at uni. And the reason I chose fine art is because I felt I had a large amount of experience already as a maker with pattern sewing. And so I wanted to be able to combine that knowledge and then use it in a more art kind of form.
So cool. Yes, kind of go more conceptual.
Yeah, and then I kind of decided, I'm going to take a year off from this after my first year, and then I ended up starting my own label. I was really young.
Did you go traveling or anything? No.
I think I just wanted to start straight away, So I did. I started my own label, and it was under my own name like it is now, but it was in a different form back then. But it was a really exciting time, actually. I had some pieces with a local store that really supported locally made, and they had a lot of young labels in there, and there was an agent that had come and wanted to take some to overseas to show them at one of the fashion weeks. So all of a sudden we were told, okay, you've got 3 weeks till we leave, and we need a collection of at least this amount of, things.
Oh, wow.
So that was kind of the start for me, and I really just started working and working and working. I mean, the longest hours, late at night.
The kind of thing you can do when you're in your 20s,
Exactly. And it was really fun and exciting, and I managed to get a lot done, but it was super exhausting and not sustainable long term. But this was back in the days when, I could walk into a few different boutiques in Perth with a collection in my hands and be like, hey, I've designed this stuff. Do you want to buy it? And it worked. But, it was just I had maybe 4 or 5 stockists in WA, and I was making everything myself.
Oh, my goodness.
Everything myself. And then eventually I decided that I just wasn't ready yet to kind of be tied down by a business.
Right.
I stopped doing that, and then I moved to Melbourne for a job, actually working for a costume designer over there. It was sort of through a contact, a friend of a friend. And so I moved to Melbourne, and I ended up living there for 12 years.
Right, wow.
And that's when I started working in other areas. So I've worked a lot in costume and also in fashion.
So what fashion jobs did you have there?
So after I did this contract, when I first moved to Melbourne in costume, then I went and worked as an assistant designer for a local label in Melbourne called Obis. And that was a really amazing job. There's not many out there like this, I think, where, The production was done pretty much all locally. And there was it was a very small team. It's a really small business, but they had, maybe now they have a few more, but at the time I think they had 2 stores in Melbourne, and they also had a lot of wholesalers, and we would design everything in the studio. There was maybe 4 or 5 of us in the studio. All the sampling was done in-house.
Oh, that sounds so cool.
On prints and colour, and it was really fun.
That sounds super creative.
It was fun. It was, I think, a real luxury in the fashion industry now to be able to work in a job like that that's so hands-on, and also being able to see the whole design process from start to finish was a really amazing experience too, because, I did all the pattern making, actually.
Wow.
Let's say I did 80% or 85% or so of the pattern making. I didn't have a lot of proper pattern making training. A lot of my pattern making, I got a foundation from these short courses I did in the beginning when I was really young. And then I kind of just taught myself or just experimented and everything. So I felt in the beginning very much like, well, they hired me and I'm going to be a pattern maker. I don't know if I'm going to be able to do this. But, that whole fake it till you make it kind of thing.
Well, it clearly worked.
Yeah, and it turned out that, I was actually a pretty good pattern maker, and I really enjoy pattern making.
Do you?
I think one thing at school I was always actually really good at was maths.
Yeah.
And I love maths because there's always a right or a wrong answer. And so, I think I just really enjoy the technical side of it as much as I do with the design. So I think that now, where I've ended up today, really much combining the technical aspects with the design. And it's very, very closely related.
I was going to say, with zero waste design, I can't imagine an area of clothing production where those things are more linked.
Yes.
Because you cannot even begin to design without considering those aspects.
Yeah.
So you're pattern making, you're designing in a kind of more traditional situation. How did you discover zero waste design?
So it really happened gradually over several years. It started when when I had this job in fashion. Once I left that, I went back to costume again. And we did a lot of production as well for this big troops of dancers and things, So lots and lots of things. And I really just started to notice the waste, and it was really something that kind of frustrated me. So I'm thinking, well, why does it have to be like this? I also worked with this amazing woman. She was like the mother of the studio in this costume job that I had. It was actually for the same designer I worked on and off for many, many, many years in different contracts. But she was a real stickler for saving all the threads and getting all the little scraps. And, we had boxes everywhere filled with all of these little bits and pieces. And she hated throwing anything out, And so it was kind of mixed with that. And then also just being able to witness actually the whole production process, because I don't think it's that common to do that these days. Often the design and the production and sampling are very separate.
Yes.
So, you've got a designer sitting there drawing a sketch, and then the pattern maker will take that sketch and make a pattern, and then, you move on to each element.
Like someone in a different continent.
Exactly. And so you're not really seeing the waste that's happening. I was often visiting the manufacturers that we worked with locally, and, you would actually visibly see it, like all of it on the floor. Also we did a lot of cutting ourselves in the times when I worked for this costume designer. We often maybe would cut like 50 garments at one time for a particular group of performers, and we would do a proper lay like you would in manufacturing. You have maybe like between 10 and 20 layers of fabric, and then you put out all your pieces, and just seeing like even on the ends you have these big strips of waste because you kind of need to account for a bit extra so that you're not short, and really it's a lot. And so that's when I just started thinking about that, and I began sort of exploring that myself in my own designs and the work that I was doing.
That's interesting. So it wasn't like you read a book or you read a blog post. It was like, this makes me feel uncomfortable. What can I do something about it?
Yeah, but then I did, of course, because I became interested in it, I started looking for resources about zero waste pattern making. At the time, the only book around was Zero Waste. I hope I'm saying Zero Waste Fashion Design by Tima
Yes.
and Holly McQuillan. Now it's quite well known, I think, for anyone that's looking for zero waste sort of resources. But that was really the only thing I could find at the time. But I found it incredibly inspiring and really, really interesting. And that was sort of the start. But then also like starting to then look at historical garments and seeing how we used to make clothing. And back when we were weaving our own fabrics, you didn't want to throw out any of that. You spend, 2 weeks weaving this narrow piece, and then you're going to throw out 30% when you cut the piece, apart. It just wouldn't be done. And so wasteful. And I think back then, you really design something based around the fabric that you were using. So if your fabric was 90 centimeters wide, you would design a garment that worked for that width.
Yeah.
You would actually take that into consideration. And something's happened along the way of, obviously, once we've started mass producing fabrics and everything's made by machines, and you're not sort of thinking so much about that waste anymore. So, I mean, of course, it's also meant that we can be really, really creative in some ways with the way we do patterns, but it's just not as much linked anymore. You usually design and then you look for a fabric that might suit it. Whereas I think it used to be a lot more tied in. Yeah.
So when did your practice become zero waste focused?
So then shortly after my first daughter was born in 2012, I sort of, I was at home I didn't have so much parental leave because we had her in Australia, but I was at home on leave, unpaid leave. And I thought, well, this is a good time to start my own thing. And it is something that I always knew I would do again.
Yeah, you're going to come back to it, yeah.
Yes, exactly. So I was like, okay, well, this is the time I'm going to start something. And so, I was working on making my ideas and building up something while she's sleeping on her naps and all that sort of stuff, as you do.
Yes.
I feel like when they're really little, you actually sometimes have more time, and then you get tricked into thinking that you've got hours in the day when they're asleep, but then they
trick you. Yeah,
I know. I was like,
no, you do need to know.
But no, so that's really when I first started working on it. So I got myself a little studio space in this local space that it was this really awesome community of artists and designers and really cheap spaces.
Oh, that's the dream.
Anymore in Melbourne, I have to say. But that was super cool, and also to just be surrounded by other people doing creative things was,
especially when you're like a new parent and.
Yeah. But I started off actually, even though it's not necessarily anything I'm really interested in doing now, I started with bags. And I think I started with that because I felt like, okay, it's easier to do maybe when I'm at home.
Yeah. Scale is smaller.
Exactly. And also I really wanted to design my own fabrics as well. So I was sort of designing my own fabrics and having them digitally printed. And I was making these bags and making them zero waste. Very simple shape, but just trying to figure out how to fit everything into one length of fabric. So I started off with that and, just kept kind of growing from there. And then when I was ready, I just moved to clothing and forgot about the bags. And then I actually didn't do all of my designs zero waste in the beginning. I would usually include 1 to 2 pieces. And at that time, I wasn't sure if it was possible to do a whole collection of just zero waste garments. I felt a little bit limited by it in the beginning. I would have these grand ideas and then I would try and make them and they just wouldn't execute. It's really actually surprisingly difficult.
I can't even imagine, but yeah.
And also I really wanted my designs to be kind of minimal and really wearable and uncomplicated. And it is actually pretty hard to achieve with zero waste designs because often you're trying to find a use for all these small pieces and I've always loved oversized stuff, but I also felt at the time, not everyone's going to want just oversized things. I need to think about a mixture. But then over the years, the zero waste designs were always the ones that were the most popular, actually, even when people didn't really know what it meant to be zero waste. They were the ones that were the most well received. So anyway, so a few years after, I ended up actually by chance getting a store that my friends had a lease on a building in Collingwood in Melbourne, and they were living upstairs and they wanted to lease the shop space out down in the bottom. So it was very kind of last minute and very do you want to take this? It's really cheap, and maybe just test it out. So I did, and that's where it all really began. I had this space. We made everything in the store, so we sort of had part of it as a studio and part of it as a store, and people could come in and see us working in the back part.
Oh.
Yeah, it was really, really cool. And so I had that for around 2 years, and it was starting to go really well and getting busier and busier. And then we moved to Sweden.
So then we quit.
Yeah, but I have to say that was always part of the plan. It just took a really long time to execute.
But that sounds like a very similar setup to what you have now.
It is.
From what I can tell, stalking your website.
Yeah, and so we kind of thought, okay, well, I knew I wanted to keep doing what I was doing, but it was just like, okay, well, let's just move the business over there.
Right.
A little bit. Yeah, a little bit optimistic. I'm not sure. It definitely wasn't as easy as I thought it would be.
Really? You're like, we did really well in Melbourne. I'm sure it'll be fine.
And we're just, it was pretty brave. And I mean, we really don't have a lot of capital behind us or anything like that. Everything, when I first started my business, I think I invested, I don't know, maybe 1,000 Australian dollars. And then I was like, all right, any more money I put into the business, I'm going to make from the business,
Right.
Very slow, like, okay, now I have enough money to buy another machine, and now I have enough money to buy an iron, very much grown like that the whole time. But we just thought, okay, well, let's just go for it. My partner, Sam, life and love partner, he ended up joining the business as well when we moved to Sweden. So we work together now as well in the business.
Awesome.
So we got a shop space here and just kind of set it up in the same way. And super tough in the beginning.
Right.
It's like a whole new country, whole new customers. It's quite different here in terms of, in Melbourne, there's this really thriving community of local makers and artists, and people really into locally made and supporting that kind of industry.
Yeah.
But here, it's not as much of it going on. So it did take a little while for people to understand as well.
Right, and really get behind the fact that you were making it right there.
And it was very much also this kind of, they see a machine in the shop and it's like, oh, do you do clothing alterations? Funny enough, that's my past, but, it took a while. But, we're really now starting to get to a point where it's becoming a little easier and, things are working a little more smoothly.
You were making clothing, or you are making clothing to sell, and then sewing patterns.
Yes.
Was that always part of the plan, or was that a kind of...
Not exactly, but I will say that there were many times in the past 10 years where I would stop and think, sewing patterns, that would be a really awesome thing to do, because I'm always having these business ideas and things. Most of them don't end up happening. But I did a couple of times in the past, maybe 8 to 10 years, it did cross my mind, and then I would do some research and look into it, and then it would feel like, oh, no, it's just, I don't know if I can do this. It felt really like overwhelming, the idea. Right. And this is me thinking of paper patterns as well, full scale, big patterns. Where am I going to get them printed? How am I going to?
Yeah, it's a big outlay.
And it's exactly. So, it was something that I'd thought about.
Sorry, because obviously you've been making garments for years, but were you aware of the kind of indie pattern scene and the way it's been emerging and growing?
When I first thought about it, I thought about it because I was like, there's nothing out there, but this is quite a while ago, because I would be sometimes looking for patterns. I usually did my own patterns, but sometimes, you'd need something for theatre or something that I was working on a particular style, or just something to have as a block or a base to sort of experiment with. And it was just, firstly, they were super complicated to look at, and this thin paper and all this stuff. And it wasn't very contemporary.
Right.
But I know now there are amazing indie pattern makers out there, or pattern companies. And so the whole landscape of that has completely shifted, completely changed, which is super exciting. But it was something I thought of because I thought, well, there's really a need for this, But then, I kept going just with what I was doing. And then it was it was actually the start of the pandemic, and we were just about to release a new collection. And at this stage also we decided to go completely zero waste. We're like, all right, we're not having any pieces in the collections that are not zero waste. I was, it's a dream of mine for a long time. I was like, one day I'm going to do only zero waste.
Right. So you're like, all in, it's time.
I was like, you know what, it's time. And then, we just finished this collection, photographed it, about to put it online, and all of a sudden, pandemic. And I was like,
no one was going shopping.
Yeah, I'm thinking, I don't know how I feel about this. I mean, firstly, I'm freaking out thinking this apocalypse kind of thing, what's going to happen?
Yeah.
Everyone was having those moments and thinking, are we even going to have a business at the end of this? Is it all? So, but I also, both Sam and I felt really strongly, like, I don't feel like I want to just start plugging all these expensive garments right in this moment. It just didn't feel right, to like, look at our new collection and check, it just was like, okay.
Yeah, the world's broken, but look at my nice new collection.
Buy my stuff. And, I mean, of course, like, it's our livelihood and we need to be able to pay our bills and all of that sort of stuff. But we're just trying to figure out, like, okay, we need to do something differently here because this is just feels like, we just don't know how to proceed. It's probably not the time to release it like this. And then actually we started posting a few things, and then we had actually a couple of our followers be like, would you put up a pattern? And I was like, you know what? Yeah, actually, we should. It was for the zero waste crop shirt, which is the first one that we did.
And my absolute favourite.
Yeah, and I thought it would be temporary, actually. I was just like, okay, this can be a really cool thing to just put out there. And actually, initially, it wasn't a PDF either. It was just this instruction booklet that I was going to put together with fabric and then send kits. So it was sort of giving our customer the option to make it themselves instead of buying the ready-made garment. And that was sort of the idea in the beginning. But then, of course, we put that up and everyone was like, can you do a PDF? Because no one wanted to do shipping and everyone just wanted to be able to load it up straight away and work on it. And actually, this is also, my second daughter had just been born. So it was a month old. And this time I was at home on parental leave, paid parental leave, because she was born in Sweden.
Note to everyone, have a baby.
Oh, it was luxury. But yeah, so from what we were used to. But yeah, I was at home on parental leave and I was having those hours in the day that I'd had with my first one, at the beginning when they're sleeping a lot in the days. And so I just thought, okay, well, yeah, I'm going to do this pattern. So I started working on it, and the first pattern was all hand drawings, like even the layouts and everything was drawn by hand.
Yeah.
And then I just put it out there, and really the rest is history. I don't know what happened. Everyone.
I love that. It's like people will tell you, like, we want you to do patterns. No, not kits, PDFs. And you're like, well, okay.
Exactly. And, I talked with a few friends in the beginning, what do you think I should do this? And, a couple of them were like, oh, maybe, you should not give away your ideas and this kind of thing of keeping these, and I thought, well, you know what, I don't really care about that. I'm going to just put it out there and see what happens. And honestly, it's been one of the best things I've ever done.
I was going to say, like, you've been just so do you feel like you've just been so embraced? Because it really seems like that.
It's just, and I think it was the right time as well. I mean, I think the whole idea of zero waste sewing and just zero waste in general has become a bit more mainstream in the last few years. My goal has always been to try and somehow change the industry in a way, but it's very difficult as a small business making that sort of impact if you're manufacturing garments. And so I'd been trying for years to figure out, like, could this work in a bigger setting? And I was, always working on these ideas of how to sort of maybe could work with bigger companies and help them to, like, reduce their waste or whatever. I was trying for years and no one really got it. No one really got the zero waste concept until we did the patterns. And I think that's been a real eye-opener for me too, because this has been now the best way for us to be able to, like, make people aware of it, because you're actually seeing the layout, it clicks. So it's really changed it. And also, in the beginning we were getting a lot of feedback, and people like, it was this click moment for me, like a home sewer who's been sort of making stuff, and, of course you have offcuts and things, and not really thinking about it so much. And I know, like, most people who are sewing, you know, they still get a bit annoyed by the offcuts, and they think, oh, I'll save a few bits, and then you're like, what am I going to do with these?
Yeah. And you think, oh, I paid for this.
Yeah. And then all of a sudden, you know, they get this layout and they cut it out and every little bit's used, and it's like, that's awesome. And so that's been really, really nice to hear. And just, it's so inspiring seeing how people are also interpreting my patterns.
Yes. Your patterns are so hackable as well, aren't they?
It's just, honestly, it's been such a pleasure seeing everyone with their designs. And I honestly didn't even know that this amazing online sewing community existed until we did this, because we were very much in the fashion side of things. And this has just been, super cool. Like, it's just such an amazing community. Everyone's so inspired by each other and so generous with information and ideas. And so it's been just really, really cool. Yeah.
Oh, that's so nice to hear. And I guess the people that would be buying your sewing patterns, they're not probably the kind of people that would necessarily have been buying your garments anyway. So it's not like you're kind of losing custom from one way or the other.
Yes and no, because I think that, sure, a large portion maybe wouldn't be buying our clothes. But I have noticed a huge amount of people who traditionally maybe wouldn't have been sewing themselves, but they might have been interested in it from a sustainability aspect, or even just, you know, then during the pandemic thinking, well, I've got to stay at home for all these months. I want to do something. Maybe I'll sew my own clothes. So we've actually really noticed like a really big portion of people too who probably would have bought our clothes before.
Oh, interesting.
Because it's that sort of like locally made and linens and things like this. So I think there is actually, I mean, now maybe they don't buy our clothes anymore because they're buying the patterns and they've learned to sew. But yeah, I do think it's actually a bit of a mix. And I think that's what's so exciting too, because there's so many more people now interested in sewing again. When I first started, you know, that was also in a time when if you wanted to be a designer, you wanted to be a designer. You don't want to do the sewing. You don't want to do the pattern making. It's totally unglamorous back then. And it wasn't really a respected trade actually either. You know, like anyone I knew that was wanting to work as a designer was very much like separated from the actual manufacturing, the sampling and that kind of technical aspect. Whereas now I feel like over the last few years there's been this revival, this new respect for craft and making, and it's super cool to see. Yeah. So now if you say I'm a sample machinist or I'm a pattern maker, people are like, oh, that's super cool.
Rather than like, what?
So the early 2000s, 90s, it's like you wanted to be a fashion designer, you know? Yeah. So I think it's really changing.
That's so cool.
Left feeling inspired? For more info about the podcast, including show notes for this and every episode, head to checkyourthread.com. I'd love to hear from you, so if you have any comments, questions or ideas for future episodes, please get in touch by emailing zoe@checkyourthread.com or find me on Instagram @checkyourthread. Massive thanks to Patrick Potter for production support, to Sylvia Seller for the awesome logo design, and to Simon at Palm Skin Productions for the music. This ad-free podcast would not be possible without listener support, so if you feel you are able, please consider signing up to the Check Your Thread Patreon. For the equivalent of buying me a coffee each month, you'll be making it possible to continue producing regular episodes. Links can be found in the show notes and on the website checkyourthread.com. I hope you'll listen again next week. Until then, take care. Bye!